From spooky legends past, down through generations, to haunted locations that hold a ghostly past. Come one, come all, come finders and seekers. Hear the creepy side of NEPA.
Welcome to the Creepy Side of NEPA. I am Dan Kozlowski. Before we get into tonight's episode, I'd just like to remind all of our listeners, please follow WNEP's Creepy Side of NEPA on Facebook. Also, subscribe to the Creepy Side of NEPA on YouTube. They're the best ways to get the latest show information. Joining us tonight for the first episode of our fall Halloween season is Matt Swayne. Matt is author of Haunted Valley, The Ghost of Penn State. He joins us this evening talking a little bit about the creepy history of Penn State University. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on.
It's a pleasure to have you, Matt. Every time, especially around the fall time, I always look for more interesting guests to bring on the show because we do a weekly show as opposed to our monthly show, and I came across your book online, and it seems very interesting.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's actually kind of a special time for me. I was born on Halloween, so that's really there's two things that sort of drove me to write this. Maybe three things actually. One is I was born on Halloween, and the second thing is I was a journalist, and I was always trying to write a really good Halloween story. And so I wanted to do some about local legends of where I live, which is in Tyrone, Pennsylvania. And so from starting to investigate around that, for stories around that area, I came across a bunch on Penn State. And then, of course, I work at Penn State, so I started to hear a lot of the legends and the stories around there.
Yeah, I'm sure while working there, you have, I'm sure, employees or students all pass down legends and stories over the years.
Absolutely. That's the part that fascinates me the most about these stories is they are almost like modern mythology in that they teach lessons. They tell us a little bit about the culture and the history. So what went from me really exploring ghost stories and things like that for entertainment, I became more aware of just the power of how these things are used to create this, what would be an oral culture in a transitory population of students. Students are always coming on and off campus and leaving and graduating and coming back for master's programs. And so these ghost stories are kind of a way to convey a lot of things about the values and histories of the Institute.
Sure, and I'm sure there has been a share of history and even a couple tragic stories on that property because it was there for so long.
Yeah, right. So it's been there, since 1855, I guess it would be. And there are a lot of ghost stories. Some of them are based on real happenings, and then others seem to be more based on the students' vivid imagination and their ability to create these stories. So, I mean, for example, just to kind of contrast the two. At Petit Library back in, I think, the late 60s, early 70s, there was a actual murder in the library in an area called the Stacks. And I don't know whether your readers are familiar with the Penn State Petit Library, but they have just rows and rows and rows of these bookshelves, stacked the whole way almost to the ceiling. And it gives you almost, it's hard to kind of, it's almost like a crypt or something that you're just, it's kind of creepy, I guess is what I'm trying to say, especially if you're alone.
Sure.
There was a graduate student who was murdered in that area. She was stabbed to death. And then later, maybe a few years later, there was started to be students who would complain of things like a cold chill. They would just get the chills walking into certain areas. They would see things. And then there was even a case of a student. Now, this would have been, I think, a high school student claiming that she saw an apparition in that area. So that story is based on something that actually happened. But I always like to call it the haunted quad, but it would really be this area around the Petit Library that seems to have the largest amount of ghost stories and folklore around it. But if you walk down from Petit Library just a little bit, and the area is called Petit Mall, if you walk down from the library a little bit, there's Old Botany, which is the oldest standing building on campus right now.
Okay.
And it was one time used as a horticulture lab. Now, there's a story there that that Old Botany is haunted by the ghost of George Atherton's wife. And George Atherton was one of the, I think he was one of the first presidents of Penn State. He was pivotal in the history of Penn State. Sort of before him, the history is that the university was kind of teetering, and he brought us back to life, I guess. He died. His grave is across the street from Old Botany. And there are students who claim that if you look up into the window, you'll see the ghost of Frances Atherton looking out on her husband's grave. Now, the rumor is that she's buried in the attic of Old Botany. I don't think that's true. No one's ever really proved that. But I think if you listen to those two stories, you do get sort of an idea of just how these real, actual events blend with kind of imaginary events, vivid imagination, and things like that. So that gives you an idea of some of the spectrum of stories you get at Penn State.
Sure, and especially when the stories are traveled down throughout time, people add a little something special, or they take a fact away or embellish another one, especially when it's handed down like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You brought that up. It reminds me of the game of telephone where you whisper facts in one person's ear and then throughout. What I found about Penn State is, so sometimes when I'm writing these stories and they'll say, oh, that never happened. It didn't happen in Old Botany. It happened outside in the Ghost Walk. And I think what it is there's just so many variations of this story. The other thing I found, and just, the kind of the history of how I wrote this, I started off with the Ghost of Penn State, Haunted Valley, and then I moved into doing a book about all the universities, as many as I could find. And what I found is another thing happens is, rather than one story being told repeatedly, a lot of times what is happening is students are adding their own little details. Like they might not have an out-and-out paranormal experience, but they might have heard a book drop, or they may have heard a strange noise. And so they add their own stories. And that's also another reason where you get this variation. It may not be one story repeated by many people. It might be many people reporting kind of on the same story.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying there. And especially it could be different locations or whatnot, just like you mentioned.
Right.
It sort of takes on a life of its own, the story does.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're researching your stories on Penn State, what are some of the favorite stories that you came across, ones that really stuck with you?
Well, I love the story of, and this is pure folklore, but it's kind of a great story, and that's the ghost of Old Coley. And Old Coley was a mule. I made the mistake once of calling him a jackass in front of a person that has a mule farm, which was a really bad mistake. But anyways, Old Coley was one of the first purchases of the back then it was a farmer school. And the farm school bought this mule to help build what would be the first of 3 Old Main buildings. And during its service, it became kind of a mascot. We were really close to being the Nittany Mules rather than the Nittany Lions at one point. But the students grew so attached to Old Coley and their stories, not only of Old Coley working on the university, but one of the things the students had to do is they had to show service to the university by going out and working on neighboring farms. So they would take Old Coley out and help some of the farmers around there. And so after Old Coley passed away, they preserved Old Coley's bones. And Old Coley was then, displayed in various areas across the campus, University Park campus. And so as these bones were displayed, all of a sudden you would have these ghost stories. At one point, Old Coley was placed in Watts Hall, and you could hear the noise. Students would say they could hear the hooves clip-clopping down the hall late at night. And sometimes they would actually hear this, hee-haw braying of a mule. And there were other people, I don't know, maybe there was a good keg party that night, but there were other students who said they actually saw the ghost of Old Coley walking down the halls of Watts Hall. And so as this Old Coley was passed around these different buildings, this other rumor kind of arose that every time they would put the skeleton in a building, there would be these ghost stories that would be circulating around it. So they were always trying to move it around. At one point, it was at the dorm, then it was in the library. Right now, it's at Hub, and there hasn't been many ghost stories there. So that's one of my favorite ghost stories about Penn State. And I think the reason I like it is it tells you so much about the history of Penn State. It becomes more than just a ghost story. You also learn a little bit about the values. So you can imagine a freshman arriving on campus and hearing these stories might get the idea, oh, well, we have this, legacy of service, and we have this, legacy of it being an agricultural, blue collar, those are all embedded in the story. So I really like that one.
Sure. And just listening to the story now, I never knew that they were thinking of having a mule as their mascot.
I know. There's so many great stories around how they used to pull practical jokes. I think they used to put Old Coley in the buildings themselves. The headmaster would come home and there would be a mule in his room. There's all kinds of stories like that. So it really is it's a really awesome story. You tell these to a lot of people who really love paranormal, and they don't think too much of it, but I think that's part of it.
Sure. It's a story that can be passed down, and it gives you a little bit of the history of that school, a little bit of the background, a little bit of what it's all about.
Absolutely. Now, as far as, a lot of times people ask me, are there, they understand the legends and they understand the folklore. Are there any, ghost stories, actual people who've had paranormal experiences? So I mentioned earlier about the grave of George Atherton, and it's right outside of Schwab Theater. Now, Schwab Theater probably has the most documented, what most people would consider sort of paranormal events, in which, as I define it, is someone who has an experience they can't explain, and they talk about it. And so there's been a couple documented cases. And one that I recall is that there was a worker there for, I think they were staging a play or they were putting on a musical, and there was a worker. And I think this is probably from the 1970s. It was written about in a magazine in the State College area. In any event, this person claimed to see a soldier that looked like, maybe someone in the Revolutionary War era come across the stage and then disappear into the wall. And, this person went on to talk about it and was interviewed by reporters. That's what I would consider a ghost encounter. And so there have been other stories there about people hearing, noises upstairs sounding like someone is walking up and down. They hear things rolling around. Who knows what those could be. But and getting back to the one thing I like to do as a former reporter is I like to get as many sides in as possible. So I have skeptical voices and voices
right.
of believers. And the one that, the criticism of the one story I told you is, well, if Penn State's founded, in the 1850s, and there's no Revolutionary War battlefields around, why would there be a Revolutionary War ghost? And so the counter to that was maybe it was an actor. So those are some of my kind of favorite stories that I like to talk about.
So how long have you been collecting these stories, all based on the campus?
Ooh, well, so I would say this goes back to, I want to say like 1996 or so.
Okay.
And back in the day, and I'm going to, date myself here, but as a reporter, what I would do is wait for Halloween to come and then go on the AP wire and see if I could find ghost stories from around what started out as Penn State. Then I looked into Pitt. Then I looked at Notre Dame and so this was really over years, and I never really thought about doing anything with it. I just I'm kind of a pack rat this way. But what I did know was that when I wrote the stories, anytime I wrote any of these ghost stories for the paper, people just would, crawl out of the woodwork to tell me their ghost stories. So I felt like there was something there, like on a marketing side, that people really enjoy these stories. So it's been a process of, a few decades, really.
I definitely agree with you. When I started this podcast, I just thought it would be, I know I said this many different episodes, but I thought it would be like maybe a few weeks special right before Halloween, and that was 3 years ago, and I never stopped. Once you start digging into these stories, they seem to just keep coming.
Yeah, well, I built this, I would have never, ever said, I had never planned this career, but I ended up at the, until recently, probably about 2 years ago, I haven't written anything more about it, but I wrote maybe 6 books, basically taking things that I already enjoy. Like I really enjoy the history of universities, and taking that. And then I did a book on haunted World War II, and I did 2 books on haunted rock and roll, where I would just take things that I naturally like. The history of rock and roll, I think, is fascinating. And then I would just tie in this paranormal element. I think one thing that I should say, because I really consider myself more of a open-minded skeptic. I'm skeptical, but a good journalist wants to kind of stay distant from whether these stories are true or not. And my point has always been that I think people get hung up on whether these stories are true. And I get into why are they so important that we keep telling them? Why do we keep investigating them? So that's important. But one thing that I did notice is after I wrote this book, a lot of people, especially janitors, would come and tell me their ghost stories. And those people really, truly believe that they have encountered something that they couldn't explain. Well, and in some cases, completely changed their viewpoint on how they approach the supernatural or the paranormal, the spirit world, whatever you want to call it. So that, I think that's important to know that I tend to emphasize the legendary aspects of it, but there's also this kind of spiritual element to it.
Sure. And I know there's 2 things that I've noticed since doing the show. The first thing that I noticed is everyone seems to have a story. Even if they don't want to admit it, something creepy seemed to happen to them. And the other thing is, even if that one creepy thing might not be paranormal, to them it seems like it might be.
You took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly
it might be able to be explained,
yeah.
But to them, they're not sure, or they don't know the explanation, and it does feel paranormal. Now, there is that percentage out there that it is actual paranormal, and you can't explain it. But there's also that percentage of the person they personally just can't explain it.
Yeah, I kind of refer to that and have read other people who write about it far more eloquently, explain it as this liminal area, this point where you're just not sure exactly what you're experiencing. And for sure, people have had those experiences at Penn State and some of the other universities that I've investigated. I think the other thing that fascinates me, to sort of go along with the theme of what we're talking about here, is that when the the trajectory of a student's life usually is you leave your house and you go to the university to kind of get rid of all these superstitions, to embrace a more scientific outlook and a more materialistic outlook. And so I find it so fascinating that these universities become these hotspots for supernatural, paranormal, whatever you want to call it, thinking and stories and whatnot. And I think I think that just goes to show the pervasiveness of these experiences.
Now, do you think the paranormal stories, like for instance, Penn State, like we were speaking of, do you think it's more because of the history of how long that school has been there, or do you think it's more because of all the people passing through in a year, passing those stories down, or even making a few legends up as the years go on?
Well, I think there are a lot of possible explanations for why these stories are so popular. I could probably go into a whole lecture about it, but I will point out a couple things and this may be anecdotal. It's certainly not, study or research that I did, but as I was writing especially the book about all these different ghost stories, I noticed that as I moved farther toward the west, there were less and less of these ghost stories. And so that kind of intrigued me. And so one of the things that I think might be behind it is just the era when these universities were founded, especially in the Northeast and the Ivy League schools and whatnot, and even the Southern schools. For instance, take Penn State, 1855. What happens, 6 years later, you have the start of the Civil War.
Sure.
You have massive amounts of death. You have a horrible, situation with slavery, and you have all of this. The people are dealing with a lot of deep issues, trauma. I would say the whole country was full of trauma, and one thing that came out of that is the spiritualism movement. And this was a kind of a common acceptance that you can commune with the spirit. So the founding of these universities coincide with this new spiritual outlook. So that might have something to do with it. I think for me, the architecture is very, I don't want to say creepy, but very solemn and grand. And it gives you almost like when you walk into a church, a certain feeling of spiritual connection. So maybe that has something to do with it. But to your point, I think it is also just all the creative minds coming in and out, open minds, experiencing these things and talking to each other and creating a culture where you can tell these stories.
Yep, and as they're passed down, like we were saying earlier, people might add something or take a fact away. But something you notice with all the paranormal or ghost stories out there, they always seem to be steeped in some type of true history when you really dig deep down deep.
Yeah, that's for sure. There's always and you can kind of tell this because in some of the cases you have a building that looks really creepy but doesn't really have any ghost stories around it. And then these other buildings, you almost feel like something must have happened to trigger these different tales to be passed around about it.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's the buildings you don't expect to be haunted. They're the ones that have the most stories.
Right.
Well, any other stories that sort of stuck with you before we wrap things up? Something else that you would like to share about your book?
Oh, I don't.
Or even one of your other books that sort of stuck with you and you'd like to share.
Yeah, well, I will say that, today we've talked mainly about Penn State campus at University Park. But I should say that we have several campuses throughout the state, and a lot of those have ghost stories attached. I think Mount Alto has one, and it is, and I'm probably going to not get all the details right, but they have an Iron Master's house there that is haunted. And this was one of the cases where I actually talked to someone who decided to go with a group of ghost hunters, and he told me he had numerous problems with his flashlight dying out in certain areas, and then taking a few steps and it would relight. So there were, I guess, the whole Penn State system is haunted, I guess you could say.
Now, when you were looking into the different campuses throughout the Penn State system, is there any one campus that seemed to have more stories surrounding it than others?
I really think Mount Alto was the one, like, now that I'm thinking about it, sticks out as the ones that had the most ghost stories about it. And there was a murder on that campus as well, as if I recall, that goes back to the 1800s. In fact, I think the person who murdered this woman on that campus was the last person hanged in that county.
Okay, just like I was mentioning earlier, all these paranormal stories have a little bit of history in the background when you really dig down deep.
Right.
Well, Matt, I love speaking with you this evening. I'd like to thank you for joining us.
Well, I really appreciate it, too. It's something I like to talk about, and I hope your listeners get something out of it.
And if anyone was interested in picking up one of your books, either the one on Penn State or the other ones you mentioned this evening, where would be the best place they could find them at?
The best place is either is on Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matt. Once again, thanks for joining us. Thank you for listening to the Creepy Side of NEPA. Be sure to like, follow, or subscribe, depending on the podcast platform that you're listening to us on. As always, until next time, enjoy the Creepy Side of NEPA.
This has been the Creepy Side of NEPA. If you have a spooky story that took place in Northeastern or Central Pennsylvania, send it to ghost@WNEP.com for your chance to share it on an upcoming episode. We're dying to hear from you.